The day my husband, David, handed me the divorce agreement was one I'll never forget. My sister, Jane, had just returned to the country, and I could feel my heart being torn apart as David said our marriage was over. The words stung, even more than I could have imagined. Yet, I signed through the pain, thinking it was the end of my story with him. But life had other plans. I was carrying his child. Despite everything, I moved on and married someone David despised, his archenemy, Simon. 4 years later, David came face to face with my child, a miniature version of himself, calling Simon Dad. His eyes turned red with a mix of anger, disbelief, and regret. He looked at me, struggling to hide his emotions, but I felt a strange satisfaction watching him realize the consequences of his choices. One morning, a positive pregnancy test turned my world upside down again. I was elated, already picturing our new family life. But before I could even share the news, David stormed in and threw a piece of paper in my face. "Cherry, let's get a divorce," he demanded coldly. "Sign this, and I'll give you an extra 20 million. I looked at him, barely recognizing the man I had loved for so long. "David, what if I told you I was pregnant?" His response left me breathless. "I had a vasectomy, Cherry. The kid can't be mine." My mouth opened, but no sound came out. David had been my only man. How could he not believe me? No explanation seemed enough as he left me staring blankly at the divorce agreement, my heart pounding with a mix of sorrow and betrayal. Our marriage had been a tangled mess from the start. It was supposed to be Jane who married David, but she'd left for another man just before the wedding, chasing a wild notion of true love. To avoid a scandal, my family had pushed me into her place, and David's family reluctantly accepted, more for the sake of appearances than anything else. The only one who truly wanted the marriage was me, having silently admired David for 7 years. On our wedding night, instead of a warm embrace, he handed me a contract, a 3-year marriage agreement. At the end of those 3 years, no matter what, he'd be free. I'd been naive, thinking if I showed him love and care, he might one day feel the same for me. I devoted myself to him, learning recipes for his stomach issues, staying up late to ease his headaches. I was always there for him, but looking back, I was just a glorified nanny in his life, a placeholder he didn't care for. I was ready to sign the divorce papers until my mother called that evening, sounding uncharacteristically joyous. "Cherry, your sister is back. She's coming over for a family dinner tonight. Bring David too." Hearing her excitement, a dreadful suspicion formed in my mind. David's eagerness for a divorce suddenly made sense. Jane was back. It was like I was in a story where Jane was the heroine, the main character, and I was nothing but a side character, the placeholder. That night, I decided I'd refuse to sign. If Jane was back to take her place in David's life, she wasn't getting it without a fight. I would play the role of the villainess if I had to. Why should I step aside and watch them have their happy ending? When we arrived at my parents' house, David and Jane walked in together. Jane had aged since I last saw her, her lively spirit dimmed, but she was still the center of everyone's attention. She stayed dry under David's umbrella while he was drenched. Meanwhile, I was left to trail behind, struggling to mask my hurt. Gathering myself, I walked up to him, clinging to his arm. "David, your clothes are soaked. You can't get sick," I said, feigning concern. David tried to pull away, but I held on tighter, ignoring Jane's narrowed gaze. Upstairs, once we were alone, he shoved me away, his patience fraying. "Stop clinging to me," he muttered in irritation. I bit back my pain. "You're my husband. Why can't I?" "Did you sign the divorce papers?" he asked, his voice cold. No, I replied calmly. I'm pregnant. He shot me an incredulous look. I had a vasectomy, he snapped. Well, are you sure you didn't get scammed by the doctor? I retorted. You're the only man I've been with these 3 years. David stared at me, anger flashing in his eyes. He had never seen this side of me, sharp, bitter, unwilling to back down. But that gentleness I once reserved for him was gone. Returning downstairs, I resumed my act, asking him to fetch water, serve food, knowing each request grated on his nerves. Jane's discomfort was almost palpable. She excused herself halfway through dinner, heading upstairs, and David followed shortly after. Once again, my mother scolded me for upsetting Jane. It was clear this family revolved around Jane, always had. I forced a smile, feeling like an invisible force in my own life. No one noticed. No one cared. I was the shadow to Jane's light. Taking a deep breath, I said, Mom, I'm pregnant. The room fell silent. Jane, overhearing, dropped her glass. The sound shattered the silence, drawing David out of the bathroom. He grabbed my hand, pulling me away from the stunned gazes. Once back home, he glared at me, his face a mix of disbelief and frustration. Why did you have to say that? Isn't it worth mentioning? I said, mocking his annoyance. Watching his anger rise gave me a strange sense of satisfaction, the power shifting for the first time. The following day, I ignored my usual routine of waking early to make his breakfast. David's assistant called, worried because David hadn't eaten. I shrugged it off. He could fend for himself for once. By evening, I received a message from Jane, a photo of David with her at a hot pot restaurant, retracted quickly with a flimsy excuse. Sorry, wrong send. I wasn't sad or angry, just amused. Later that night, David was hospitalized with stomach pains. It turned out he'd eaten spicy hot pot, a dish his weak stomach couldn't handle, but something Jane loved. When I arrived at the hospital, David looked away, embarrassed and angry. I casually mentioned I'd only brought leftovers for him, feeling oddly pleased with his discomfort. In the hallway, I bumped into Simon, David's archenemy. He'd always been charming, albeit insufferably smug. I heard you've been stirring up trouble, Cherry, he teased. Rolling my eyes, I retorted, Stop calling me that, it's disgusting. But a small part of me couldn't deny enjoying his attention, if only for how much it annoyed David. A few days later, I went to the doctor with plans to terminate my pregnancy, but fate had other ideas. Due to your health, an abortion could be dangerous, the doctor warned. That night, I dreamed of a story where Jane was the heroine, David the male lead, and I was a background character, doomed to watch them live happily. But I woke up determined to change the ending. I'd raise this child on my own terms. Just as I left the clinic, I saw Simon again, grinning as he noticed the obstetric sign. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, feigning concern. I didn't answer, but somehow, his antics, his confidence, his disregard for David's authority made me laugh. That brief happiness turned into misfortune when I missed a step and stumbled, instinctively clutching my belly. The last thing I remembered was Simon rushing toward me, calling for help, his voice unusually frantic. When I woke up in the hospital, I saw David standing by the door, but it was Simon who sat beside me, his face etched with genuine worry. Why are you so reckless? Simon muttered, attempting to cover his concern with annoyance. David, visibly tense, stepped between us. This is my wife, he growled. So Cherry has a husband? Simon replied, smirking. I thought she was here alone because he was dead. David looked like he wanted to throw Simon out the window, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. For the first time, I saw David's possessiveness, his hesitation about letting me go. But I wasn't about to back down. "David," I said later that night, "I think I'm falling for Simon. I'll sign the divorce papers as soon as I get back." His face fell, and something in his eyes softened, a crack in his cold facade. But it was too late for regret. The next day, I returned to my family's house. My mother sat me down with Jane, asking me to consider a divorce for Jane's sake. She and David belonged together, they said. In that moment, I realized they'd never cared for my happiness. With a calm I hadn't felt in years, I asked, "$5 million. I'll sign if you give me $5 million. My family looked taken aback, but they agreed, eager to appease Jane. David arrived, reluctantly going through the motions, the weight of our years together hanging between us. As I signed, I looked at him and said, "Remember, David, I gave you everything, but now I'm giving myself back." Walking out, I felt the chill of freedom, but the warmth of my child's future in my heart. I'd rewritten the ending to my story, finally the main character in my life. And as for David and Jane, they could have their story, whatever it was. Mine was just beginning. After years of doubt, suspicion, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal, Jane had finally confessed everything. Her words played on repeat in my mind. "Now no one can stop us from being together," Simon had told her with disturbing confidence. He looked at her with a gleam that mixed triumph with passion. "You're insane," Jane had retorted, her tone trembling with frustration. "You did all this just to get back at David, and you think what? That I'll want you to be a stepdad to my child?" Simon laughed softly, savoring the idea. "David's kid calling me dad? Just the thought is satisfying." He rubbed his chin, his gaze distant, lost in the imagery of winning. I moved past him, Simon trailing behind like a shadow, rambling on about the so-called benefits of marrying him. His insanity both appalled and amused me, easing my heartache in a strange way. But I knew I couldn't stay here, tangled in a web of his games. So, I made my decision to leave the city I had called home for over 20 years. I craved a fresh start, far away from everything familiar. I booked a one-way ticket to a small town thousands of miles away and left without looking back. But, to my shock, as soon as I stepped off the plane, there was Simon. He stood there with an infuriatingly smug smile. "What a coincidence, Cherry," he said, reading the surprise on my face. "You didn't follow me, did you?" He grinned, voicing the exact words I wanted to say to him. Soon after, I arrived at the small house I had bought online, eager for the peace I had envisioned. But as I approached, the door across the street opened, revealing an overly familiar-faced Simon. "Cherry, you're living right across from me?" He looked genuinely delighted. "Just admit it, you're into me." I bit my lip, annoyed, and walked into my new home, slamming the door harder than intended. It was move-in ready. The previous owners had left it clean, with only a few touches left for me to make it feel like mine. Just as I started to settle in, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, David. The name alone triggered old memories, stirring emotions I thought I'd left behind. I answered, hesitated, then hung up before he could speak. Blocked. Within minutes, another call from an unfamiliar number came through. This time, a familiar voice spoke. "Cherry, it's David's friend. David is drunk. Can you pick him up?" A ridiculous request, considering we were divorced. "Call his secretary," I replied, quickly ending the call. I blocked that number too, but David's people continued to hound me in the days that followed. They claimed David was in the hospital, that he had cried himself to sleep missing me, and even that he had a cold. The absurdity of it all confirmed one thing: he and Jane were determined not to let me move on. I changed my number and created a new account, finally achieving the peace I had longed for. In the days that followed, I threw myself into my new life. I opened a quaint flower shop on the ground floor of my building, surrounding myself with vibrant blooms. Life began to feel serene, with each day bringing small joys. That was until Simon walked in, dressed in a sleek suit, his gold-rimmed glasses accentuating his sophisticated look. He bought a bunch of roses, then handed them back to me, arranging them in the vase on my counter. Despite my attempts to ignore him, Simon was relentless. He was persistent in his mission to replace David in every way. One afternoon, as I went out to receive a delivery, I was suddenly blinded by headlights and felt the rush of an oncoming car. My mind went blank, frozen with fear. But just as quickly, I felt a rough yank as someone pulled me out of the way. It was Simon, breathing heavily, his glasses gone, and his hair a mess, a stark contrast to his usually pristine appearance. "Simon, are you okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned as he lay on the ground, grimacing in pain. "I'm fine, Cherry." He tried to laugh it off. "A little car can't hurt a black belt in Taekwondo." Yet he winced as he moved his leg. My stomach twisted as I saw his injured leg. "Don't try to act tough," I scolded, dialing for an ambulance. "I'm calling for help." Simon managed a lopsided grin, trying to brush it off. "Cherry, don't cry," he whispered as he noticed the tears I hadn't realized were forming. "Look, I can still jump," he added with a forced laugh. "Stay still," I said firmly, holding his hand. "If you move, I'll cry even more." He obeyed, staying put until help arrived. The hospital stay turned into a strange new chapter for us. I stayed with Simon through his surgery and helped him as he healed, visiting him daily with homemade meals. Despite his tough exterior, he milked the situation for all it was worth. "Cherry, can you bring me some water?" "Cherry, my shoulder hurts," and his usual. "Cherry, my leg hurts, come kiss it better." One day, as I sat by his bed, David suddenly appeared at the door. He looked tired and worn, his face showing the strain of sleepless nights and regrets. "Cherry," he said, his voice rough. I barely looked at him, but Simon couldn't hold back. "Get your filthy hands off my girlfriend," he snarled from the bed. "Cherry's with me now, so back off." I held my ground as David tried to pull me aside. "Are you here to give me an invite to your wedding with Jane?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my tone. David shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Cherry, I didn't marry Jane. In fact, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. I've come to realize I never loved her. It was always you." But I felt nothing. The thrill, the ache that used to be there when David looked at me had disappeared. In its place was Simon's voice, and his grin, and even his laugh that had once annoyed me. "I'm sorry, David," I said, a small smile playing at my lips. "I don't love you anymore." David's eyes went wide with shock. "Cherry, don't trust Simon. He's only doing this to spite me." I cut him off. "When I needed you, when I was sick, you had work." Simon, on the other hand, threw himself in front of a car for me. "You have no right to question him." David's face fell, and he finally walked away. Everyone has to face the consequences of their actions, I thought, and David was no different. Over time, Simon's antics continued, though his injuries healed. When he was finally able to move freely again, I began to notice his deeper, genuine side. beyond the rivalry and bravado. We grew closer, and he became my constant companion. The day I gave birth to my child, Simon was right by my side, clumsily yet carefully holding the tiny baby. "Come on, say daddy," he cooed, a strange pride gleaming in his eyes. The baby looked at him with wide, innocent eyes, and the warmth in Simon's gaze softened something in me that had been hardened for years. When our child turned 2, Simon and I officially got together. By the time the baby was 3, we got married in a quiet ceremony. Only a few friends and family were present, and we exchanged vows with our little one as the flower girl. As we walked out of the chapel, I noticed a shadow in the crowd, a familiar face watching from afar. David was there, holding the hand of a small child, one who bore a striking resemblance to him. But I didn't linger on the past. I turned my gaze back to Simon, smiling at the man who had stood by me. Years later, Simon revealed the truth of his strange memories, the reason he had felt such an immediate connection with me. He confessed to a past life where we had been inseparable, a time when he had been my faithful friend, always by my side. "I'm lucky," he said, pulling me close, his voice warm with contentment. "In this life, I got to find you again, and this time, I won't let you go." We built our life together, one where happiness was a choice we made each day. And as the years passed, I realized that, in choosing Simon, I had found a love that was not just born from passion, but from loyalty, patience, and unwavering devotion.